I am 73 years old now, and my hands shake when I hold my teacup in the morning. The doctors say it's just age, just the body forgetting how to be still, but I think it's memory. I think it's all those years of holding things too tightly, of gripping onto people who were already slipping away, of clutching at a life that was being stolen from me one small piece at a time. My name is Margaret, though nobody calls me that anymore. My son calls me mother when he remembers to call at all, and my daughter-in-law, well, she has her own names for me, I'm sure, whispered behind closed doors in that house that used to be mine. But I'm getting ahead of myself. That's what happens when you're old. Time becomes a strange river, flowing backward and forward all at once, and you find yourself standing in the middle of it, watching your whole life pass by like leaves on the current. I was 22 when I met Thomas. He was 25, with hands rough from working at his father's construction company and eyes that were gentle in a way that made you believe the world might not be so hard after all. We met at a church social, one of those Sunday afternoon gatherings where the older women brought casseroles and judged the younger women's hemlines, and the men stood in clusters talking about things that seemed important but probably weren't. Thomas didn't stand in clusters. He stood alone by the lemonade table, looking uncomfortable in his pressed shirt, and when I walked up to pour myself a glass, he said, "It's too sweet. Mrs. Henderson always puts in twice the sugar anyone needs." And I laughed, and he smiled, and that was it. That was the beginning of everything. We were married 8 months later in that same church, with flowers that cost more than we could afford and a cake that my mother made with her own hands, crying the whole time because I was her youngest and she knew once I left, the house would be too quiet. Thomas worked hard. He worked so hard. I can still see him coming home in the evenings, dust in his hair, cement on his boots, exhaustion written into every line of his face, but always stopping to kiss my forehead before he even took off his jacket. We had our son, David, 2 years after we married. I remember holding him for the first time, this tiny creature with Thomas's nose and my stubborn chin, and thinking that I finally understood what people meant when they said love could break your heart. Because it did. It broke my heart wide open, made me vulnerable in ways I'd never been before, made me understand that from that moment on, I would never again know a day without fear, without the terrible knowledge that something you love so much can be lost. But we were happy. For 23 years, we were happy. Thomas built his father's company into something bigger, something solid, and we bought a house on Maple Street with a garden where I grew tomatoes and roses, and David grew from a baby to a boy to a young man with his father's work ethic and his mother's cautious heart. He went to college, studied business, came back with a degree and a girlfriend named Patricia who wore too much perfume and laughed too loud at jokes that weren't funny. I tried to like her. I swear to you, I tried. I invited her to dinner, asked about her family, complimented her dresses even when they were too tight and too short. But there was something in her eyes when she looked at our house, at Thomas's truck in the driveway, at the life we'd built. She looked at it the way a hawk looks at a field mouse. Hungry. Calculating. Waiting for the right moment to strike. They married anyway, because David loved her, or thought he did, or maybe just loved the idea of her. And I smiled at their wedding and danced with my son and tried not to see the way Patricia's mother counted the guests, assessed the gifts, whispered to her daughter with eyes that sparkled with something that wasn't joy. Thomas told me I was worrying too much, that I needed to let David make his own choices, his own mistakes if they were mistakes to be made. He held me that night in our bed, his hand warm on my back, and said, "He's a grown man now, Maggie. We raised him right. We have to trust that." And I wanted to believe him. I wanted so badly to believe him. Thomas died 3 years later. A heart attack at 68, sudden as a thunderclap in a clear sky. One moment he was alive, eating breakfast, complaining good-naturedly about my burnt toast, and the next he was gone, collapsed on our kitchen floor while I screamed for an ambulance that came too late. They tell you that grief gets easier with time, but that's a lie. Grief doesn't get easier. It just gets quieter, settles into your bones, becomes part of your breathing. I mourned him every day. I still mourn him. Every morning when I wake up alone, every evening when there's no one to share the silence with, every moment when something happens and I turn to tell him, only to remember that he's not there, he'll never be there again. David was kind at first, in those raw months after the funeral. He came by regularly, helped with the house, held me while I cried. But Patricia. Patricia started asking questions. Questions about the will, about the house, about Thomas's business, which David had inherited but which I had a 40% share in, as was written in the papers Thomas and I had signed years ago. It's just practical planning, she'd say, her voice dripping with false sweetness. We need to understand the financial situation. For everyone's benefit. Ever. David would look uncomfortable, but he never stopped her. Never told her to wait, to give me time, to let me grieve in peace. And slowly, so slowly I barely noticed at first, things began to change. They started coming by more often, but the visits felt different. Patricia would walk through my house like she was measuring it for curtains, would comment on how much space it was for one old woman, how expensive the upkeep must be, how worried they were about me managing everything alone. You should think about downsizing, she'd say, her hand on my arm, her perfume choking the air between us. A nice apartment, something easy to maintain. Less stressful for you. And David would nod, his eyes not quite meeting mine, his father's spine apparently not inherited along with his father's business. The real shift came about a year after Thomas died. David sat me down one evening, Patricia beside him like a ventriloquist's dummy, and explained that they thought it would be best if I signed over my share of the business to him. It's complicated, Mom, he said, and I could hear Patricia's words in his mouth. The legal structure, the tax implications. And honestly, you don't need the headache of being involved in business decisions at your age. We'll take care of everything, make sure you're comfortable. I stared at my son, this man who used to curl up in my lap when he had nightmares, who used to beg me to read him one more story before bed, who used to tell me I was the best mother in the whole world. And I saw a stranger. But I'm not stupid. I'm old, but I'm not stupid. I said I'd think about it, that I needed time, and I watched Patricia's jaw tighten, watched the flash of irritation in her eyes before she covered it with a smile. After they left, I sat in Thomas's chair, the one that still smelled faintly of him, of sawdust and Old Spice, and I thought about what was happening. And I got scared. Not the clean, sharp fear of something immediate, but the slow, creeping fear of seeing a trap closing around you and not knowing how to escape. So I did what any sensible woman would do. I called Thomas's lawyer, Martin, who'd been our friend for 30 years. I told him about the visits, the pressure, the requests. And Martin, bless him, didn't dismiss me as a paranoid old woman. He listened. He asked questions. And then he said, Margaret, I need you to check something for me. Can you access your bank account online? I could, barely. David had helped me set it up years ago, written down the passwords in a little notebook I kept in my desk drawer. It took me 20 minutes of fumbling and cursing my old fingers, but I got in. And that's when I saw it. Small withdrawals at first, $50 here, $100 there, amounts that could be explained away as helping with groceries or utilities if I ever noticed. But then larger ones. 2,000. 5,000. 10,000. All authorized by David, who I'd added to my account years ago because Thomas had insisted, just in case something happens to me, Maggie. Just so someone can help you if you need it. David had been taking money from my account for months. Thousands of dollars. Money that Thomas and I had saved over 45 years of marriage, of sacrifice, of doing without so we could build something secure for our old age. I felt something crack inside me then. Not break, but crack. Like ice on a frozen pond when the temperature starts to rise, that moment when you realize the thing you thought was solid has been weakening all along. This was my son. My baby boy. The child I'd carried for 9 months, nursed through fevers, taught to ride a bike, sent off to college with a trunk full of hope. And he was stealing from me. Not just money, but trust, but dignity, but the last shred of family I had left in this world. Martin told me what to do. We moved quickly, quietly, like soldiers in enemy territory. I opened a new account at a different bank, transferred everything, closed the old account. I changed all my passwords, secured my documents, made new copies of everything important and put them in a safe deposit box that only I could access. And then I called David and told him I was ready to discuss the business share transfer. I could hear Patricia's excitement in the background, her voice sharp with triumph, and something cold settled in my chest. Something that felt like resolve. Like the last bit of my mother's steel spine finally showing itself in me. They came over the next evening with papers already drawn up. Patricia's doing, obviously. David at least had the grace to look uncomfortable, to shuffle his feet, to avoid my eyes. Patricia was all business, laying the documents out on my kitchen table, pointing to where I needed to sign, talking fast about how this was the best thing for everyone, how much simpler it would make everything. And of course, she said, her smile wide and empty, we'll make sure you have everything you need. Your family. The word tasted like poison in the air between us. I picked up the papers. I read them slowly, even though my hands were shaking so badly the words blurred. And then I looked at my son, really looked at him, trying to find some trace of the boy he used to be, some hint of Thomas in his face. David, I said quietly, before I sign this, I need to ask you something. Have you been taking money from my bank account? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the clock ticking in the hallway, could hear Patricia's breathing suddenly go sharp and fast. David's face went white, then red, and he opened his mouth but nothing came out. Patricia recovered first. That's ridiculous, she said, her voice high and brittle. David would never. $43,000, I said, still looking at my son. Over the last 14 months. I have the statements. I have everything. David's face crumbled. Just collapsed in on itself like a building with its foundation removed. Mom, I can explain. We needed it. The business had some cash flow problems, and I was going to pay it back. I swear I was going to pay it back. You were going to pay it back with my own money, I said. With the business share you're asking me to sign over to you right now. You were going to take everything your father and I built, everything we worked for, and you were going to give me nothing in return except the privilege of living in my own home until you decided it was time for me to give that up too. Patricia stood up so fast her chair fell over. This is absurd. We've been taking care of you. You should be grateful. Get out, I said. My voice was quiet, but something in it made Patricia stop mid-sentence. Get out of my house. Both of you. David tried to talk to me, tried to apologize, tried to explain, his words tumbling over themselves in desperate knots. But I was done listening. I was done making excuses for him, done believing that somewhere inside this man was the little boy who used to pick dandelions for me in the yard. That boy was gone. Maybe he'd never really existed at all. Maybe I just loved the idea of him so much I'd invented the rest. I stood up, my old body suddenly feeling stronger than it had in years, and I walked to the door and opened it. If you try to contact me again, I said, I'll press charges for theft. Martin has already filed the paperwork. It's ready to go. Patricia's face twisted with rage, but David just looked broken. Small. Lost. And I felt nothing. Where my heart should have been breaking, there was just emptiness. Just the cold, clean space where love used to live. They left. I closed the door. And I stood in my quiet house, in the home that Thomas and I had filled with 45 years of life, and I finally let myself cry. Not for what I'd lost, but for what had never really been there. For the illusion of family, of belonging, of having someone who would choose you, who would protect you, who would love you the way you loved them. I cried for Thomas, who would have been devastated to see what our son had become. I cried for the grandmother I'd never be, because I knew that whatever children David and Patricia might have, I would never know them. I cried for myself, for the old woman who'd been called foolish and senile and too old to understand, when I'd understood perfectly. I'd understood everything. That was 8 months ago. David tried to call a few times at first, but I never answered. Martin handled everything legally. The theft charges were filed and settled quietly. David paid back the money with interest to avoid prosecution, sold his share of the business to his partner, moved with Patricia to another state. I heard through Martin that they're divorced now. Apparently when the money troubles got real, Patricia found someone else's field to hunt in. I wish I could say I felt satisfaction at that news, but I didn't. I just felt tired. I still live in my house on Maple Street. The tomatoes are coming in well this summer, fat and red and sun-warm, the way Thomas always liked them. I tend my garden every morning, my hands shaking less when they're in the soil, when they're doing something that matters. I have tea with my neighbor Dorothy on Thursdays, and Martin stops by sometimes just to check on me, to make sure I'm all right. I am all right. Not happy, maybe, but all right. There's a difference, and at 73, I'm finally learning what it is. Sometimes I lie awake at night and think about David, wonder if he ever thinks about me, if he ever regrets what he did. Wonder if he tells himself stories to make it all make sense, to turn me into the villain of his own narrative. Maybe he does. Maybe he has to. Maybe that's the only way he can live with himself. I don't know. What I do know is that I protected myself when no one else would. I was the old woman they thought wouldn't understand, wouldn't notice, wouldn't fight back. But I understood enough. I understood everything. And in the end, that understanding was the only thing that saved me. I look at Thomas's photograph on the mantel every night before I go to bed. I did what I had to do, I tell him. I hope you understand. And in the silence of my empty house, I imagine I hear his voice, warm and solid as it always was, saying, I know, Maggie. I know. It's not enough. It will never be enough. But it's what I have. And so I hold my teacup with my shaking hands, and I tend my garden, and I live in this house that's too big for one old woman, and I remember. I remember everything. Because that's what we do, we old people. We remember. And sometimes, that's the only justice we get.